Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm honored to be joining you here today. I'll be contributing to a fantastic panel entitled Subverting Silences, Absences, and Distortions, focusing on the critical importance of teaching African studies as part of a broader effort to decolonize the curriculum. My name is Dr. Meghan Healy-Clancy. I'm an assistant professor of history at Bridgewater State University, pictured on the Zoom background behind me, so you can imagine we're here. I'm Bridgewater, Massachusetts. I am also a non-resident fellow at the Harvard University Hutchins Center, the Du Bois Institute, African and African American Research. I gained my PhD at Harvard University in 2011, and at Harvard I focused on the study of South African history. My research more broadly focuses on gender and the anti-apartheid struggle. It's the current project I'm working on. In the past, I've published on the history of women's education in South Africa. And hopefully in our panel discussion, we may have some opportunities to talk in a little bit more detail about my research. But I'll be spending much of my talk today reflecting on teaching, and particularly reflecting on some of the challenges that I have routinely encountered in trying to teach Introduction to African History courses. And I say Introduction to African History courses, but really even when you're offering an upper level course, you're often encountering some students who are really substantively studying Africa for the first time at a college level. Right? Many of us, right, in the audience here today, similarly, may have first come to study African history in American universities as opposed to in high schools. Right? So in other words, right, to make a long story short, often students come into our classrooms. The majority of our students at a place like Bridgewater State, right, have not been anywhere on the African continent. Some of our students may have parents from Africa, right? We have a very large Cape Verdean population, for example, at BSU. Some students, may have family or friends with connections to the continent, but, right, like many of your high school and elementary school students that you're working with, our students tend to be pretty ill-exposed, right, to the realities of the African continent in the present, never mind the complexities of African history. And so I'll be reflecting today on some themes that I've encountered in my teaching at an array of institutions. And before I came to BSU, I was teaching at Harvard. I've also taught at Lesley University. I've taught at the Harvard Extension School, right? I've worked with a really diverse array of students. And I found that, across a number of backgrounds, students who were raised in the American educational system, indeed students that were raised in educational systems shaped by European colonialism, right, which is to say a startlingly high number of the educational systems in our world today, have grown up with a lot of misconceptions about Africa's past, present, and place. So, when we're teaching African history at any level, in an American classroom, we are going to have to be confronting the reality of Western ignorance about Africa. So this slide gives us a sense of a sample Google search for "why is Africa?", which brings to bear all of these stereotypes, misconceptions that are far too common in the United States about the continent, right? Why is Africa called the Dark Continent? Why is Africa so far behind? Right? These questions that are really shaped by these Western ideas of lack, which were rooted in the colonial experience. Change slide, please. And of course, right, as we'll be discussing further in our panel discussion, many African intellectuals have pushed back against these stereotypes from the very moment of colonial encounters beginning through conquest and resistance to conquest. And one of my favorite recent pieces of African writing that pushes back against these Western stereotypes is by the late Kenyan writer, Binyavanga Wainaina. Among other things, he founded a fantastic literary magazine in Nairobi. He's a widely published author of fiction, memoir, nonfiction writing of various sorts. If you haven't had the pleasure to see his work, you must check it out. And what he's perhaps best known for amongst teachers of African history in American universities, right, the audience, of course, everybody's always trying to get, right, is his really fantastic piece, How to Write About Africa. And that piece appeared in a special issue of the British literary magazine Granta back in 2006. It still feels fresh, unfortunately, right? But it's been around for quite a while now. And this was part of a special issue on African writing, published by this magazine out of London in 2006. And this article, right, spoiler alert, the title is How to Write About Africa. In fact, it is How Not to Write About Africa. It begins with the memorable line, always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. Right, so beginning with this idea of, as he goes on to say later on in the piece, treating Africa as if it is all one country, devoid of complexity and particularity and difference. Other memorable quotes from the first page of his essay include, never have a picture of a well-adjusted African on the cover of your book or in it, unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. The first page of this essay continues, taboo subjects, ordinary domestic scenes, love between Africans unless a death is involved, references to African writers or intellectuals, mention of school-going children who are not suffering from yaws or Ebola or female genital mutilation. The piece goes on to state, Africa is to be pitied, worshipped, or dominated. And so, this is a 4-page essay. Basically, every sentence packs a punch against these Western misconceptions and stereotypes about the African continent. And all of these quotes appear right on the first page. I often assign this as our first reading assignment to students in my African history classes. I've been doing this now for years, so I've had sort of a little generational change almost with students. And so as students read this essay, they often, lately students have been pointing out that African intellectuals have sort of successfully pushed back against a lot of these stereotypes in, say, Western journalism. Right, many of us might be able to think of examples of African Twitter, right? Very active Twitter communities that have been, very, very rightfully taking to task bad coverage of Africa in publications like The Economist or the New York Times. Other students have pointed out, though, right, particularly students that are perhaps, less intensely following the news, that a lot of these kind of stereotypical depictions persist untrammeled in popular culture. Right, and so this is really a rich way to open up discussions in a class focusing on African history or on other interdisciplinary topics in African studies by beginning with this really, pull no punches critique of these longstanding Western stereotypes, discussing how students have perhaps, despite their best intentions, internalized some of these stereotypes, explaining the colonial histories behind them, and thereby beginning the process of thinking ourselves out of this colonial past in our classrooms. So the first important myth that Wainaina's piece dispels here is this myth of the empty land. That quote, the myth of the empty land, is from another of my favorite pieces of writing, a 1980 essay by the South African scholar Shula Marks, which you all might check out in your leisure, in which she looks at this idea, in South African history, this myth that Dutch settlers and British settlers promulgated, that when they arrived in South Africa, the land was basically empty. Right, the Mhane, the wars of conquest and expansion meant that people had moved around by the 19th century. Prior to that, the Dutch claimed that the landscape was completely barren, etc. Right, many of you may recognize this sort of myth of the empty land as playing out in other historical circumstances as well. And in African history, right, this myth of the empty land sort of retained this powerful force as a form of not only white settlers trying to excuse conquest, but also, more lately, it's become a sort of form of colonial nostalgia, right? These invocations of a beautiful, unspoiled landscape as being the quote unquote real Africa. Right, and so this idea that Africa, as Wainaina talks about in the satirical piece, is this place of endless sunsets, empty savannas, right, occasionally interrupted by an elephant or a giraffe strolling by, right? This idea of Africa as this beautiful vista without people, that has a really ugly colonial past as a justification for conquest. And yet, right, this idea of when you think of Africa, you think of an acacia tree and a sunset and an empty landscape, right? Students often realize this idea, it remains very conspicuous in our culture. I like to show this slide that comes from the excellent website, Africa as a Country. Again, like Wainaina's essay, that's a satirical title, right? It's trying to point out the complexities of the diversity of the African continent. This excellent image called The Dangers of a Single Book Cover, which appeared on the website in 2014, which shows us, right, this astonishing array of novels from the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, who we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. Her novel about the Biafran War, Half of a Yellow Sun, right? That gets that sort of sunset, acacia, empty landscape treatment. So too do novels by South African writers like Nadine Gordimer. You can see that the range of books here that get this same title, whether their topics include coverage of stories about cities, whether their topics include stories about love, about loss, right? Like whatever their topics are, however serious or frivolous they may be, all of these books get this cover that signifies, to a Western audience, this idea of a beautiful, peopleless Africa, right? Which is an extremely violent idea when we think about the history of colonial conquest and how settlers tried to use this claim that landscapes they encountered were empty to justify various forms of violence, including genocide. Right? And we can again think of examples beyond African history, but this is a particularly pervasive myth in the colonial encounter in the African context. Another important myth that Wainaina dispels in his piece is this myth about Africa as being sort of no ordinary place, right? Something that a lot of the sort of most searing insights in Wainaina's satirical essay bring to mind, right, is this idea that Africa in Western writing is too often treated as being this place of extremes, right? Either everything is going as terribly as things could go, right? Or we're having this sort of fantastic miracle and this economic transformation that's, the new frontier and everything is as wonderful as you could imagine, right? There are these very extremes that we see in Western reporting on African countries. And, that we also see in the depiction of Africa's history in a lot of ways. And so this image of covers of The Economist magazine, right, gives us a clear sort of sense of this depiction of Africa as a spectacular place, right, for better and often for worse, that is far too common in the Western media. And these Economist covers, right, they changed dramatically from the year 2000, depicting Africa as a hopeless continent, to these increasingly optimistic covers, to this claim that there is a new scramble for Africa, which Elsa's presentation talked about, this idea of the scramble for Africa as a very Eurocentric way to talk about the experience of colonial encounter. Right, we're seeing this sort of broad generalization, right? And Wainaina's protesting against this in his piece, highlighting that this, of course, really evades tremendous complexity and substance in Africa's past, present, and future. The other myth that Wainaina's piece takes on, right, is this myth that Africans are not ordinary people, right? That they do not experience the sort of, and they have not historically experienced the sort of full range of ordinary experiences that we expect to encounter when we're taking a course about the history of the United States, say. And this idea that, Western writing about the African continent has too often assumed this, again, sort of extreme depiction of Africans' experiences, whether it be extremely bad or extremely good. This is, again, deeply rooted in colonialism, right? Deeply rooted in, say, missionary writings about Africa. In my scholarship, I've done a lot of work on the history of girls' education in South Africa, which has included spending more time with the writings of 19th century missionaries than perhaps anyone should have to do, right? And in the writing of missionaries, right, you see this sort of constant movement from Africa as a place of utter despair, right? And they're always sort of talking about Africa writ large, even if they're specifically, as in my research, talking about a particular part of the continent, KwaZulu-Natal, right? But this idea that, Africa is this place of either the greatest hope, the greatest optimism for the salvation of the world, or it's the place of the greatest despair, right? We see these extremes that continue to shape the kind of media diet that many of our students are exposed to when they come into our classrooms. And African writers and intellectuals have again, long fought against that, right? There's a fantastic book by the South African writer, Wheelock called The Rediscovery of the Ordinary. It was inspired by one of his essays by this title that he wrote in the 1980s at a wonderful conference about the sort of future of literature in post-apartheid South Africa, in which he's arguing that it's not just colonizers that are depicting Africans as sort of extraordinary, right? It's also these liberation movements, right? He's thinking about the way that the anti-apartheid movement is really constructing these sort of exceptional heroes, really focusing on these moments of high drama, and that's having, he argued, repercussions for how literary writers are able to imagine the realities and complexities of the South African experience. More recently, the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie gave what might be perhaps the most popular TED Talk ever, The Danger of a Single Story. This is a TED Talk that many of your students actually may have seen. Beyonce has sampled some of this, and maybe she sampled something else by Adichie, but she made Adichie pretty famous with even kids that aren't fans of literature a few years ago. And, so this piece, The Danger of a Single Story, right, the title sort of says quite a lot here, right? This idea that she's talking about her own experiences coming from Nigeria to the United States, how Americans have these simplistic stereotypes of Africa, but she spoke about how as well, she found that she herself often had simplistic assumptions or understandings about other Nigerians, about other African countries, and about Americans, right? So there's a way in which this talk really beautifully sort of brings to bear the broader stakes of appreciating complexity, right, within both the study of Africa and more broadly, right, being a human being in our complex world. So, finally, Wainaina's short, hard-hitting 4-page essay closes with this sentence: always end your book with Nelson Mandela saying something about rainbows or renaissances, because you care. And this, because you care is particularly hard-hitting in this essay, as he really attacks, sort of self-styled liberals, saviors, that, quote unquote, that are people who see themselves as trying to uplift Africans. They're sort of the inheritors of the 19th century missionary tradition. But it's interesting here, right, that he also invokes Nelson Mandela. And this is an image of Nelson Mandela's 70th birthday tribute concert, which was held in a packed stadium, as you can see here, in 1988 in London. And his invocation of Mandela is interesting to me as a historian of South Africa, because often when students come into my classes, they know very little about South Africa. To his credit, Trevor Noah has helped students learn a lot more about South Africa. But often sort of what students come into my classes with is this sort of vague knowledge of Nelson Mandela as basically a saint, right? They sort of don't know much about him, but they know that he's, a hero who saved his country. And, as scholars of South Africa have been working to dig into for years, right? And as South African anti-apartheid activists as well, right? And as in a lot of ways, Mandela himself, right, have been pointing out for years, that sort of construction of a great man myth is really linked, right, to this broader history of understanding Africa as an exceptional place of either unspeakable brutality or unimaginable heavenly hope, right? The sort of search for a white savior, or search for a Black savior, or search for a father of the nation to liberate people from suffering, right? This has been a sort of recurrent theme in writing by outsiders about the continent. But when we're, actually teaching about a subject like the anti-apartheid movement, it becomes impossible, right, for students to maintain that narrative, right, for students to uphold this idea that someone like Mandela is a savior, or that a country should be looking for a savior, whether that be in an African context or in an American context. And so, we see in teaching about a topic like the anti-apartheid movement, which is something that I teach about in all of my African history classes, but I also teach upper level seminars for seniors and Master of Arts in Teaching graduate students on the anti-apartheid movement. So teaching about this topic, as well as teaching about other liberation struggles, other moments of complexity and difficulty in Africa's past, right? There's sort of three principles that I pursue as a scholar. And as a scholar, of course, to note my obvious positionality here, right, as a white woman from Chicago, born in the 1980s, right? So as a woman from a particular perspective, right, who grew up in the American educational system, who's trying to get beyond these problematic colonial inheritances that shape, consciously or unconsciously, too much of our teaching about Africa's past, present, and future, I try to adhere to these three principles in my work. The first is in appreciation in my scholarship, and particularly in emphasis in my teaching on the tremendous diversity of the African continent. The second is, this is a classic historian's point, right? But an emphasis on complexity, right? The historians in the audience will appreciate this as our sort of coin of the realm in our discipline: change over time and complexity, right? Thinking about, trying to understand complicated moments like the anti-apartheid struggle with a lens that gets beyond this idea of angels and saints rescuing a country, right? That gets to the extreme difficulty of the moral choices with which people were faced, right? Bringing to bear a growing array of fantastic new scholarship on the anti-apartheid movement. It gets at this complexity. I would recommend the Princeton historian Jacob Blamini's work in particular. I can make more literature suggestions in our panel if people are interested in going deep into South African history. But then finally, my third suggestion is to think about your position, right? And to think about yourself as a teacher, a scholar, someone that's trying to change the world of how things are imagined and understood, to approach this task with humility, right? To not fall into the trap, right, of becoming an aspirant savior oneself, right? To try not to center oneself in your work, to try as well, right, to impart this sort of sense of humility to your students, right? That, imparting to them this idea that if they take, say a course on the anti-apartheid movement, that should only be the beginning of their learning about that, right? There's no way that they can learn about the complexity of this movement within your standard semester, right? Indeed, I don't think that I'll have enough about South Africa. And I think, students may feel overwhelmed. But I think, one of our tasks as teachers is to show students how exciting intellectual curiosity and not knowing can be. Potential for lifelong learning and discovery and asking new questions, not only about the particular topic of our courses, in this case, the South African past, but also sort of using those questions for own texts. Right? Teaching South African history often enables students to ask really bold new questions about the United States, racist past and present and future, right? Try to think about how to unthink American racism through some of these lenses of anti. So quickly, this first point about diversity. I'll give a shout out to the Boston University African Studies Center here for their tremendous resource, this poster, How Big is Africa? Right, and so this just, I often use this slide at the opening of an African history class, or frankly, like any of my classes, right? Whether it be a general intro to world history or whatnot, just to really highlight, right, from one limited vantage point, size, right, how large, diverse, and complicated the African continent is in terms of the number of languages, in terms of the number of countries, in terms of religious practices, right? Every metric of diversity we can imagine, right? The African continent is replete with such diversity. And so, as much as we can make these generalizations about how outsiders have depicted Africa problematically, right? We've been doing that throughout this presentation, and I'm including with the other scholars that I'm citing in this talk. I realize I'm recording alone in my office, but we've been talking throughout this presentation, right, about this sort of homogenizing external narratives of the African continent, but in fact, the African past reveals tremendous diversity, as we'll talk more about in our group discussion, I'm sure. The other important point to think about, of course, is complexity. And I like to teach quite a lot, not only because this is my scholarly interest, the interest of my current research, but also because I think it offers us a tremendous lens into complicating this search of a great man sort of narrative in South African history. I like to talk about women in the anti-apartheid struggle. So with Mandela, right, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, his former wife, offers a tremendously fascinating life story, a tremendously fascinating vantage point through which to think about some of the complexities and limits of this argument that Mandela saved the nation. Right, for one thing, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, right, in recent years, made some very, very bitter statements, saying straight out, right, this idea that my ex-husband was this kind of heroic saint, this is complete nonsense, right? She directly said in an interview around the time of Nelson Mandela's passing, a widely publicized interview, she said, it wasn't Mandela that saved this country, right? It was the women and youth of this country, right? Our leaders in the anti-apartheid struggle, my ex-husband and others, they were in jail, they were on Robben Island. It was, the people who were left behind that fought for freedom. This is a very provocative statement. Students are often kind of shocked by how provocative it is. But it is, in some ways an over-exaggeration of certain facets of the struggle, but it also speaks, right, to a reality, right, to the differences between how the anti-apartheid struggle looks from a particular grassroots perspective as opposed to an elite one. And it speaks to, more broadly, Madikizela Mandela's own experience of, sustaining, in some ways, the Nelson Mandela as savior myth for a long time as a strategic objective of the anti-apartheid struggle, while at the same time sustaining a massive grassroots resistance network within the country, both in Soweto and then subsequently in this incredibly hostile, remote town to which she was exiled in the Free State, where she's pictured here, this town of Brantford, in 1977. And this picture, right, which was taken by the famous photographer Peter Magbane, was very deliberate. Right? It was everything about Madikizela Mandela's presence as an activist during the long period of her husband's political imprisonment was a very strategic effort to keep the anti-apartheid movement both within the country and within exile alive. And so, looking at the role of women and gender in the movement, this is just, one way with one topic in the broad swath of African history in which we can appreciate this greater complexity. Finally, of course, is humility, right? My current research, I'm looking at the Federation of South African Women, which is a fascinating multiracial movement against apartheid, which comes together in the 1950s. And my research is trying to look at how this mass movement formed and how it sustained itself in these very difficult years of the struggle, and particularly how women work together across difference, right? And in this work, I'm thinking very much, right, about collaboration across racial lines, about positionality, and about these many forms of power differential that shape our work as scholars, as teachers, as researchers. And so, I look forward to talking further, perhaps in our panel discussion, about, how our positions shape the work that we do, and how, as teachers, we can be aware of this, right? Be aware of where we're coming from and how that both opens and limits the questions that we can ask in ways that are we might say sort of empoweringly humbling, right? A sort of sense of, trying to be humbled in front of all that we don't know while trying to pursue greater understanding in a way that, optimizes our students' ability to ask their own questions about the past, that puts us as teachers more in the position of guides and less in the position of these sages. So I'll finish here with a few reading recommendations that I've referenced in my talk. I realize I've referenced more readings than this. I tend to do that, but a couple core texts here, Wainaina's and Adichie's. I'll include these links with the slides that you can view in your leisure. And also a short piece that I wrote that extends upon what I was saying about teaching the history of the Mandelas. I wrote a piece in our university journal about, which is oriented toward these discussions about teaching and learning, about my experience teaching about the life and legacies of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, which you may find interesting. First, it's a very short piece for sort of probing some of these points more deeply. And then finally, a couple of book length recommendations that high school history teachers in particular may find directly useful and assignable to your students, and teachers at all levels may find interesting to read yourselves to enrich your curriculum. These are first a very now classic book. It's in its 4th edition, Mistaking Africa, which is looking at unpacking the sort of colonial roots of these myths that I've been talking about in this presentation. And then finally, a textbook that locates Africa in world history. This is a textbook that I think could work very nicely, again, as a directly assigned material for more advanced world history classes, but also could really wonderfully inform a lot of curriculum for lower level teachers as well. And certainly I know many of my former students who have gone on to be wonderful teachers have found this book, Africa and World History, very useful as a reference for designing their own curriculum. So thank you so much for your time. I really look forward to our discussion. Be well.